Anger is intensifying in China amid rare protests against the country's strict zero-COVID policy.
Demonstrations have entered the third day with no sign of slowing, and they have turned political, with many now calling for leadership change.
That's right. Well, for more insight, let's speak now with Ross Feingold. He's a director of business development with security and evacuation services firm SafePro Group. Ross, good morning to you. He is, of course, joining us from Taipei this morning. Ross, so we've seen these protests over COVID restrictions before, but how would you describe the nature of the latest demonstrations that are gaining momentum in the country? And what are the chances of them leading to something potentially more violent?
That's right. There have been protests periodically over COVID restrictions. Usually we've seen that with people who are confined to a housing estate, for example, or a small community, and they're not allowed to emerge from within a blockade around a neighborhood. It seems that the fire in Xinjiang, which unfortunately took the lives of 10 people amid accusations that COVID restrictions inhibited response from emergency services, it really is an impetus for additional protest. And we see that manifest itself with makeshift memorials and people gathering to pay their respects to the victims of this fire. So it does seem to have the emotional aspect of where people are very sympathetic to the victims, and that leads to anger. On the other hand, will this grow? We have to keep in mind that even in the period before COVID, protests were not unusual in China. We often tend to forget that. But whether it was about property disputes or migrant labor or factory labor, protests are simply not unusual. And the authorities do usually step in relatively quickly. So that is the pattern. And that's probably what we should expect to see this time.
Are there any indications that authorities are or could be rethinking their zero COVID policy? Most countries have transitioned to living with the virus. Why has China not?
It's a very difficult political decision. Of course, they seem to be waiting for the party Congress to end and to, from their perspective, to occur successfully. And of course, they do spin that whatever transpired as a success, despite the images we saw of Hu Jintao being escorted out. But the increase in cases that occurred nearly simultaneously or in the days after the Congress really was a break on what the government had hoped for of a period of positive announcements about the end of restrictions. So it's just that they put themselves in this position where they're very reluctant to get away from this zero COVID approach. And just when they thought the timing was right to do so, they did have an outbreak, and they're just not bold enough to really make that departure. I mean, they might at some point, but I think the protests might also slow down that schedule a bit, even if locally in some municipalities, they will give the authorities a green light to relax restrictions to try and give people a pause from protesting.
Ross, you mentioned the Congress meeting. I mean, this comes just about a month after President Xi secured a third term. How big a concern is this for President Xi and the Communist Party?
Well, from the perspective, again, of having dealt with protests over various issues across many years, it's a concern, but they probably are also thinking we've seen this before and we know what to do, whether that's to make some announcements that will make people happy, some kind of cash payout, and then ultimately the use of force. Of course, people looking at this from outside China are going to discuss whether or not this time is something different. What could we do, or from outside China? What could NGOs or other governments do? We saw that the statement you played from a U.S. health official, but the interesting thing there is that was really more from a health policy perspective. He wasn't really commenting about from a human rights or a democracy kind of perspective. So we'll also have to watch if foreign governments sort of get involved by way of saying we have to stand with the protesters, kind of akin to what they've been doing recently with Iran.
Well, President Xi Jinping is now into an unprecedented third term and looks like he could rule for life, potentially. China doesn't do elections in a democratic sense. Is there any way of knowing what the people think of his stay in power?
we have some access to social media. Of course, it gets removed very quickly. A conversation that's about politics, and certainly conversation over the past 48 hours about the protest, that gets removed as quickly as censors can remove it. There's always a struggle to balance, how many people are enthusiastic for the party and the decisions the party makes and are just happy with it, or just want to stay away from politics, versus the people who are unhappy with the process. And another interesting aspect of that is we have to be frank that there's not as much foreign media who are based in China now. So if we look at the reports over the past couple of days about the protests, very often the reports will note that they spoke to somebody by phone, or they viewed video online, because a lot of foreign media just isn't on the ground in the numbers that they used to in China. So that also inhibits our access to information.
And Ross, if this ends up being a long sort of stalemate, what would the prolonged instability in China mean for the country, its economy, and in the region?
Well, for those of us who might be doing business or have a need to travel to China, it's certainly something to think about. Again, there was an expectation that a lot of the restrictions would start to be removed, and it would be easier to visit China for business and or for pleasure. So people have to be prepared for rapid change, whether that's on the upside or the downside. So if you do have plans and you still go to China, you have to be prepared that there could be a sudden imposition of restrictions. On the upside, it's possible one could plan to go to China and plan for a lot of downtime, but then suddenly restrictions are removed and actually it does become easier to move about. And then one would suddenly be scrambling to make arrangements to meet or travel from city to city. So one has to plan on both sides of that. But of course, visitors should stay away from protests.
And Ross, one last question for you. You're speaking to us from Taipei. President Tsai Ing-wen has resigned as her party leader following heavy losses in local elections. What else should we know?
Well, you mentioned the key word, which was the local elections. This was about local governance. But now that election is over, the key thing to know is the presidential and legislative elections here in Taiwan are in January 2024. So to the extent that the focus was or properly should have been on matters of local governance, we're now moving into the national election season. It's only about 13 months away. So the conversation now will become about Taiwan's relationship with China. And as candidates start to position themselves to obtain the nomination of their party, there's going to be a period of very intense politicking here in Taiwan.
All right, Ross, thank you so much for your time and your insight this morning. Ross Feingold, Director of Business Development at the SafePro Group.